All right, let's start reading Memoirs of Cleopatra again. And then this is like after the dinner. I would have answered, but a terrific blast of thunder made it impossible to talk. The house shook. We stood and watched the trees bending outside, their heavy limbs whipping up and down, and heard the deluge of water striking the ground like an army of javelins. I had grown up being told that our climate of Egypt was gentle, and that was one of its gifts, but I had never appreciated what that meant until I saw the fury of this Roman thunderstorm. Caesar put his arm around me, and I leaned against him silently. I had not realized how weary I was until then. The dinner had been a strain. Now we were alone, but not really alone. Calpurnia was upstairs, doubtless straining her ears to hear us. In her place, I would have done so. At length, the rain tapered off, dying in fits and spurts. Parts of the garden were flooded, and the heavy smell of wet earth now swept in through the doors. The thunder rumbled away, trailing lightning from its skirts, and raged clouds tore across the sky. An almost full moon burst out from its inky confines and shone with an eerie light over the scattered leaves, soaked benches, and muddy puddles. "Take a cloak," he said, "and pull it over your hair. I wish to show you something." A servant brought him one along with mine, and together we arranged them to cover our heads. He took my hand and guided me outside to the shadow of the Temple of Vesta. "Look," he said, pointing down the length of the forum. It lay in stark black and white, its shadows sharp and deep. It was almost deserted. The lateness of the hour, the wildness of the storm had driven everyone away. Now devoid of the crowds and noise, it took on the dignity and grandeur it had lacked during the busy afternoon. The temples covered porticos, the statues and commemorative columns bespoke a splendor I had begrudged it earlier. "This is the Via Sacra," he said, tapping the pavement beneath our feet. "This is where I shall ride my chariot in the triumphs, on my way up to the temple of Capitoline Jupiter. And there," he pointed down to an area before a covered assembly hall, "is where the viewing stands will be set up for the dignitaries and leading citizens. You will be seated in the front seats along with the rest of my family." He seemed most anxious to point out to me the precise spot. "I am going to have silk awnings to protect you all from the sun. They will say it's extravagant. To hell with them, in spite of the largesse that will be distributed, and all the games to entertain them. Ungrateful dogs, there's no pleasing them." "Stop," I said. "You are agitating yourself for no reason." His hand, which was holding the lantern, was shaking. I feared he was about to suffer an attack of his illness. "Are you all right?" "Yes, of course," he sounded annoyed. "I haven't been troubled with that since just before the Battle of Thapsus. It sought to prevent me from fighting, but I overcame it." He paused. I overcame it by willpower. I did not see how that could be, but I kept quiet. Thousands of people will be in the processions, the magistrates, the senators, captives, and my troops, and the booty. You won't believe it. Wagons and wagons of it, mountains of gold and arms and jewels, and the sacrificial oxen. We have all those things in Egypt, I said. Indeed, it was the Egyptians who had perfected such parades and displays. I had long since grown accustomed to them. We were walking along the Via Sacra, being careful to avoid the wide puddles everywhere. The moonlight came and went, fast-moving shadows of clouds rolling over the buildings. The temple of Castor and Pollux, with its tall white columns, looked like a row of unearthly trees, revealed and then eclipsed again by the passing shadows. You sound jaded, he said. But this will impress even you. He paused. I have waited a long time for recognition for my achievement in Gaul. I pray it is all you hope for, I said. We passed 3 men who had likewise ventured out for a walk. None of them glanced at us. None of them thought the 2 in plain cloaks could be anything but fellow citizens. They were speaking about the storm and something to do with a shopping stall. It was the same conversation one could have heard in any city in any country. Come, said Caesar, steering me over to the right. We passed near the Curia and by a stout building that was built into the Capitoline Hill. I had not noticed it before, although I would never tell Caesar I had come here earlier to see the Forum for myself. What is that? I asked, pointing to it. The Tullianum prison, he said, the place where state prisoners are kept. Is my sister there? I could not picture proud Arsinoe in a prison. Yes, along with all the others to be displayed in the triumphs. There's the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix and little Juba, son of the Numidian king, and Ganymedes, Arsinoe's accomplice. What happens to them afterwards? They are executed, he said, in the little chamber beneath the prison cell. Always? Of course. They led armies against Rome. Now they must pay the price. But they are killed privately. It is not part of the spectacle. He paused. It is not sad. What's sad is their lack of self-respect. If they'd had any, they would have committed suicide rather than end up like this. Surely the child is innocent of his father's deeds, I said. Oh, Juba will not be killed. He will be brought up in a Roman family. Arsinoe is a woman. Do you execute women too? Did she lead an army? He made it sound so simple. If she fought like a man, she must die like one. I had seen my other sister executed by my father's command. I should accept it. Arsinoe had tried to kill both me and Caesar. In my place, she would have had me dispatched without a second thought. Still, defeat and exile were a great punishment in themselves. You do not sound very merciful, I said, and yet you are known for your clemency. That depends on who I am compared to, but no one spares foreign enemies, your own countrymen. Well, that's a personal matter. I myself believe that if someone wishes to join me, having previously fought against me, he should be welcomed. I burned the papers of Pompey that I found in his tent. I did not wish to know who had corresponded with him. That is very magnanimous of you, I said, but is it not rather foolhardy? We were traversing a small street that was completely dark, and I had to take Caesar's hand since I did not know the way. Perhaps, he said, but I believe that any other way leads to tyranny and provokes such hatred that you cannot survive. But if you pardon your opponents, like Brutus, it seems to me that you must do more in order to please them and bring them around. Just pardoning them without making any attempt to win them over is purposeless. It achieves nothing. They should be grateful to me. Not unless they like you. It seemed so obvious to me. If someone we hate does us a favor, we spurn both the person and the favor. I would never fawn and pander to them, he said. I leave that to Cicero and his like. Cicero wants so badly to be loved and appreciated. He is like a girl just coming into womanhood who peers into the mirror constantly to check his appearance and analyzes every remark anyone makes. Fuh. There was no arguing with him. Perhaps he was right. We stumbled along the dark paved street. Where were we going? The office of Pontifex Maximus. How did you get appointed to it? I was curious, and it seemed a safe subject. I bought the election, he said. In Rome, everything is for sale. Abruptly, we swung around a corner, and I saw before me Caesar's new forum. The clouds had vanished, and the moonlight shone full and bright on its white perfection. Even though I had already seen it, in this light it was supremely beautiful, and it took my breath away. This is my gift to Rome, he said, a new forum. He strode across the half-paved courtyard, keeping hold of my hand. We mounted the steps on the side of the temple, and then he bent to light his lantern. And this is my gift to the goddess Venus Genetrix, who founded the Julian clan through my ancestor Aeneas, this temple which I vowed to build if she would grant me victory at Pharsalus. His voice was hushed in a reverence of his own creation. The portico sheltered a number of paintings, Greek by the looks of them, and there was a suit of antique armor on one of the walls. The inner recesses of the temple was dark and silent, and it had the smell of new stone, a dusty, sharp smell. It echoed with our movements, and it felt cavernous, although I was not sure how I sensed that, since I could see nothing. Caesar swung the lantern over his head, illuminating a little circle around us. Still the corners and the far end were invisible to me. He walked as silently as a priest to the back. Looming ahead, I saw 3 statues on pedestals, large statues. Here's the goddess, he said, holding up the lantern to the face of the middle one. She had an expression of supreme contentment, with a mysterious smile, and her marble breast was laden with pearls. Arcesilas of Greece carved her, he said. So you have indeed honored her, I said. He is among the greatest of living sculptors. He swung the lantern to the right, lighting another statue, this one of himself. Then he said, "And this is my gift to you," and moved the lantern to the left, to the remaining statue. She leapt out of the darkness. She was myself. Arcesaurus wants only to see you in person in order to refine the details, said Caesar. What have you done? My voice was trembling. I was stunned. I have ordered a statue of you in the robes of Venus to put in the temple, he said simply. In your family temple, I said. What can you be thinking of? I wanted to. What are you trying to say? I kept staring at the huge statue, myself wearing the robes of a goddess and flanking his protective goddess and himself. What will people think? What will Calpurnia think? Aren't you pleased? He sounded disappointed, like a child. The affront to public opinion is part of the gift. Anyone can make gestures that earn him credit with the masses and offer them up to his friends. But to risk displeasure, that's a gift of a higher order. What do these statues say, I asked. What do you mean them to say? What would they mean to you if you saw them as an ordinary citizen? They would mean that you are descended from Venus, that your house is semi-divine, and that I, in my incarnation of Venus and Isis, am your consort. What else could I think? Just so, he said. This is exactly what I mean. He stood and stared at them. I felt led to do it. I know not what repercussions there will be, but I could not disobey. Now, do you believe I love you? Yes, indeed I did, but there was more than love at work here. It seemed mad to court such public disapproval. I will dedicate the temple in between triumphs, he said. There will be games and banquets. Yes, I could think of nothing more to say. We must be bold, he said. We must be who we are and not shrink from it. Do you believe your victories have earned you the right to do as you please? I asked. Is that why you do not hold back? I only know I must follow my own instinct, he said. It has never failed me yet. My goddess of fortune leads me on. All she asks is that I grasp eagerly what she offers. This was not offered by fortune, but conceived and built by you. You did not stumble on this temple, you created it. I created the victories in Gaul, in Alexandria, in Pharsalus, in Africa as well. Fortune offers you opportunities to create. She does not hand you presents. I could not answer. There was no answer, or none that would satisfy him. He was bent on this course, as he had been bent on crossing the Rubicon and marching into Italy. But whereas others had given him reason for those actions, in this case, no one but he was involved. They will blame me, I finally said. They will say I made you do it. I care not what they say. Yes, you do. You cannot be that lofty. You are not a god to disregard the opinions of men. To regard them overmuch is to be less than a man. To cower and grovel, and you are describing a beast, not a man. There is a middle ground between arrogance and prostration. He set the lantern down on the shining marble floor, plunging the upper part of the statues into darkness. He took my shoulders gently. Show me that middle ground, he said. You tread it so well. But then you have had many more years of practice than I. You were born royal, born to rule, recognized as a goddess from your childhood on. So you mix that element with the human so easily. Just be Caesar, I said. That is enough. Then I added, and do not wound enemies you do not have the heart to kill. He stood silently for what seemed a long time. I could hear water dripping off the pediments of the temple outside, splashing onto the pavement, the aftermath of the storm. He bent down and kissed me, tightening his arms around me. I would conduct a worship of Venus here, he said softly. Short shafts of moonlight were lying in bands at the entrance to the temple, and I knew we were alone. The goddess was looking down at us as well as the idols of ourselves, waiting to see what we would do. When the dedication of the temple takes place, we would have already made offering to it, he said. His arms tightened around me, and I felt myself longing for him. The enforced, polite distance between us during the dinner had sharpened the ache for closeness, but there had been too much talk of enemies, of executions, of fate. There had been too much of the company of Brutus, Calpurnia, and Octavian. It was not a promising night to indulge in the pleasures of Venus. Those who worship Venus must come to her wholeheartedly, I finally said, pulling back from him a bit. My mind is clouded with all that has passed this night before we entered her temple. Ask the goddess to remove it, he said. His voice was low and persuasive. She can do so. I marveled at how he could put aside troubling thoughts and be only here. The echoing space of the pristine temple indeed seemed to be crying out for some warmth, some stirring to break the spell of incompleteness within it. I let him guide me back into the utter darkness of the apse, behind the base of the Venus statue. He left the lantern on the floor in front of it, and a soft, diffuse light shone from around the sides. Have you not a villa for this? I protested weakly. A villa with a room appointed with couches and coverlets and windows opening onto a garden that lets in the smells of paradise? You know well I have, he said, but it is missing one thing all lovers want, and which we have never tasted: privacy. Behold, a paradox. The richer you are, the less of it you have. Now we shall have it, by heaven. We shall have it. His voice was warm in my ear, and I felt myself melting with it. He was right. We were alone as we had rarely been before, and might never be again. He eased the sleeve of my gown down over my arm and kissed my shoulder lingeringly. I could feel my own bones beneath his lips and became at once aware of my body. The confusing thoughts of the mind began to take flight. I love you, he said. I would die for you. Hush, he said. Oh, I love you, I said. I would die for you. Hush, he said. No talk of dying. That belongs to poets, not to queens. He kissed me then strongly, and I returned it, clinging to him in the darkness. We were alone. He was mine, and I was his. The goddess above us looked down with favor. Brilliant sun. Piercingly blue sky. A slight breeze on this day, the first triumph. I sat in the special stand of seats constructed along the Via Sacra to enable exalted guests to observe the last, most important part of the triumphal parade that wound its way through the Forum and then up to the temple of Capitoline Jupiter. We would wait a long time in the sun, which is why Caesar had ordered silk canopies to be erected over us. They flapped now, billowing as each breeze passed through them, diluting the light and turning it blue. Ptolemy was beside me, and in the other places of honor were Calpurnia, Octavia, Caesar's nephew Quintus Pedius, and his grandnephew Lucius Pinarius. He had a very small family. People had begun waiting long before dawn along the route he would pass, from the Campus Martius and through the Circus Maximus, before circling the Palatine Hill and entering the Forum. I could hear the roars and shouts from far away as he appeared at each station and wondered what they were seeing. I was impatient to behold it. At midday, I saw a slight movement from the far end of the Forum, and soon a company of men appeared. Slowly, very slowly, they wound their way down the Via Sacra, past the Temple of Vesta, past the Temple of Castor and Pollux, past the half-finished porticos of the Basilica Julia, and then abreast of us. The faint strains of music grew louder, and the leaders of the procession, the musicians with their trumpets and pipes, passed by. Behind them came a company of priests, swaying as they lift their thuribles of incense high, the sweet perfume burning in the summer air. Then came a vast company of dignitaries, the officers of the city of Rome, and behind them the senators, walking proudly in their magisterial togas. There must have been more than 500 of them. Then a shout went up from the far side of the Forum, and as the elaborately decorated wagons trundled into view, I knew why. It was the spoils, heaped high in carriages built of Gallic timber and inlaid with citrus wood. Spears bristled from the wagons, shields rattled, the wagons strained under the weight of the gold and silver. Sometimes a goblet or a platter would fall off, and people would dash out to grab it like dogs lapping up leavings from a table. Wagon after wagon groaned past, sagging under its mountain of gold. The wheels of one got stuck between the paving stones and had to be heaved out. Caesar must have raided every hamlet, stripped every rural altar of its trappings. There must be nothing left in Gaul of value. A company of men paraded past, holding signs with the names of battles. Alesia, aged in... I can't say that one. Bibract, Lugdunum, Gregovia, Avaricum, unfamiliar names for the wild, unknown places where Caesar had conquered. Agendincum, that's what I think it was, Agendincum. And then a decorated wagon with an effigy of the ocean in chains rolled past. with a sign denoting the invasion of Britain. Then came a company of prisoners, long-haired chieftains clad in leather and furs. Behind them, walking alone, came a tall figure in chains. It was Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who had led a mighty uprising of the Arverni tribe against Caesar, and had finally been defeated at Alesia, where Caesar had emerged victorious against an enemy 5 times his number. Vercingetorix had lost none of his proud bearing in the 6 years he had been waiting for his march through the forum on his way to death, and the crowd, jeering freely at the other prisoners, fell silent as he passed by. I shuddered. In the next triumph, our sinewy would walk in his footsteps, passing before us in defeat. The shame, the unendurable shame of it. Following Vercingetorix paraded the sacrificial animals bound for the temple, columns of white oxen with gilded horns, garlanded and curried, the thanksgiving offering Caesar would make for his victories. From the further end of the forum, a vast shout arose, and I knew that Caesar had finally entered it. Preceding him came the lictors, all 72 of them, allowed because Caesar had been dictator 3 times. They carried those ugly bundles of branches and the gleaming axes, and I liked them no better this time. Their ceremonial red capes made bright spots like blood as they passed by. Then Caesar himself, high in a gold chariot, pulled by 4 horses, he stood like a god, dressed in purple and gold, looking out at the people. In his left hand he held an ivory scepter surmounted by an eagle, and in his right a laurel branch. Behind him stood a slave, holding the heavy gold crown of Jupiter over his head, a crown too weighty for a mortal brow. A frenzied shout arose from the throats of all who beheld him. They showered him with flowers, with personal tokens and treasures, with bracelets and earrings. Behind him, slight and straight, rode Octavian in his own chariot, as the only other adult male in Caesar's family. The triumphal chariot passed us by, moving on like the chariot of Phoebus transiting the sky, and I saw wave after wave of people rising to their feet and shouting. Then suddenly the procession stopped. The triumphal chariot sagged and lurched. I heard a buzz of confusion. Caesar stepped out. The axle of the chariot had snapped. Just as he drew abreast of the Temple of Fortune, he dismounted and stood on the pavement, then immediately walked to the steps leading up to the Capitoline Hill, to the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, where he was supposed to ascend to dedicate his wreath and scepter. He fell to his knees at the first step and shouted in a ringing voice, "Behold, I will climb to the temple on my knees as a sign of my submission to the will of fate." And he did so, laboriously making his way up the long incline, his purple toga trailing on the ground behind him. The people roared their approval. By quick thinking, Caesar had turned a bad omen into an occasion of good grace. But the incident unnerved me. It was very bad. Behind Caesar came his troops, the men who had made his victories possible. They were happy, shouting, "Lo, triumphe! Hail to the God of triumph!" and singing at the top of their lungs. But I was not so happy when I heard the words of their verses. Home we bring our bald whoremonger. Romans, lock your wives away. All the bags of gold you lent him went his Gallic tarts to pay. The crowd roared at that and cheered. Then followed more verses. Gaul was brought to shame by Caesar, by King Nicomedes he. Here comes Caesar, wreathed in triumph, for his Gallic victory. Nicomedes wears no laurels, though the greatest of the three. Nicomedes, that king of Bithynia that his enemies claimed had been Caesar's lover. I had thought it was a lie. Someone had shown me the libel Cicero had written in private letters. Caesar was led by Nicomedes' attendants to the royal bedchamber, where he lay on a golden couch, dressed in a purple shift. So this descendant of Venus lost his virginity in Bithynia. Evidently, the soldiers preferred to keep the lie alive. Now the crowd screamed with laughter, and there was worse to come. Caesar tarried in Egypt, taking in all the spoils, the lighthouse, the library, Queen Cleopatra, and her many perfumed oils. More roars of laughter. I watched Calpurnia. She was smiling gamely, and I attempted to do likewise, but I was furious. More verses followed. If you do right, you will be punished. But if you do wrong, you will be king. I stiffened when I heard the word king. Why was that word on everyone's lips in connection with Caesar? Why was he suspected of it? I knew his association with me must be part of it. Who keeps company with a queen but a king? And when they saw what he had put in the temple of Venus Genetrix, a seemingly endless file of the soldiers marched past, following Caesar at their forefront. I heard wild cries of joy, and I was later told they were receiving gifts for their courage and loyalty. 10,000 denarii for each centurion, 5,000 for each legionary. The crowds were surging. Other soldiers had to hold them back. The poor, too, expected to receive largesse. After the sea of soldiers passed, it was over. The sun had swung around until it was almost shining in our eyes, despite the canopy. I saw a procession of litters coming down the Via Sacra, swaying in rhythm with their bearers. All the honored spectators from this section were to be transported to the Circus Maximus, where the celebratory chariot races would be held. As part of the triumphal games, Caesar would open them as foreign rulers. Ptolemy and I would be seated nearby, but I would not be next to Caesar. Calpurnia and Octavian would have that honor. Even though it was a long way around, we were taken up to the Capitoline Hill so that we could honor Jupiter by passing his temple. Before it now stood Caesar's chariot, and in the inner recesses of the temple, I could see the seated statue of Jupiter sitting majestically in the dimness. Beside it was a new bronze one of Caesar, his foot upon a representation of the entire world. Later I was told that it had an inscription saying that Caesar was a demigod and that Caesar had just ordered the inscription removed. The doomed oxen were placidly awaiting their sacrifice, which would take place as soon as the last of the litters left. Priests were standing by, smiling benignly, even stroking the beasts. We descended from the hill and made our way through an area crowded with shops, markets, and apartments, and then we were at the Circus Maximus, the enormous racetrack that lay in a valley between the Palatine and the Aventine hills. Huge walls encircled it like a rim, inside of which tier after tier of seats arose. We were taken in through the entrance arc, while soldiers held back an enormous crowd waiting to rush inside once all the dignitaries were seated. I could see that people were already in the special section under its arched roof. There was the purple toga. Caesar was there. We approached slowly, and I watched him, searching to see how he looked, how he behaved. He seemed very tired, and his eyes kept sweeping the arena as if he was expected an ambush. The day had told on him, and now when he thought himself unobserved for a moment, he had let his guard down. He looked every bit of his 54 years. There were harsh lines sculpted between his nose and mouth, and his neck was gaunt. His eyes were wary, not happy. On this day he had so longed for, respectful, pleasant, he nodded to Calpurnia. Then he caught sight of us approaching, and he instantly altered his expression. Any doubts I had about his feelings for me were swept away. His face truly lit up, and the years lifted from it. He stood, his purple toga with its gold embroidery glinting like an ancient treasure. He wore the gold laurel wreath, and its leaves encircled his head like a corona. "Hail, great triumphator," I said, "the greatest on earth." "Hail, great Queen of Egypt," he said, "and King of Egypt." He indicated Ptolemy. "Pray, take your seats of honor." All the members of his family, small as it was, were seated around him. Where his son should have been sat Octavian, who was only a great nephew. But Caesar had a son, and someday that son would sit beside him, Caesarion. Ptolemy and I were seated with a number of distinguished foreign visitors and envoys who had traveled for the occasion. The kingdoms of Galatia and Cappadocia and the cities of Lycia, Laodicea, Tarsus, and Xanthus sent ambassadors to the east that so fascinated and titillated the Romans. The stands filled rapidly as spectators rushed in like a wall of water. Their spirits were high. A wild excitement filled the air, as palpable as the heaviness just before a thunderstorm. Caesar was talking to Calpurnia and Octavian, leaning over attentively. I saw that he was seated on his special chair. It was gilded and had a carved back. Undoubtedly it signified something. In Rome everything did. At last the arena was full. Every last place was taken, and the stands were a sea of color. The trumpeters, a company of at least 50 men, rose from their places and sounded their horns. The notes rang out, both glad and stirring. The noise of the crowd subsided. A professional caller, a man with the loudest carrying voice I had ever heard, took his place at the railing before Caesar. "Romans, noble guests," he yelled. There were more than 100,000 spectators. Could all of them hear him? His voice rang and echoed all around us. "We are here to honor our triumphator in the ancient way, inherited from our ancestors, with contests of valor and skill. Here before you, the young knights will race their horses to the glory of Jupiter and Caesar." A roar went up. He held up his hands for silence to continue. "We will begin with the Ars Desultoria. Accept their offerings." Caesar then stood up. He raised his right arm and cried, "Let the games begin." Immediately from the gates at the far end of the circus, 2 horse pairs emerged, trotting nervously. The horses, the finest I had ever seen, gleamed in the afternoon sun. On their backs were young men who waved and bowed to the crowd before coming to our section and making obeisance. There were some 20 pairs of them, and the horses seemed to be matched in size and speed. At first they all trotted abreast, once around the track, but then the first pair left the others behind and went into a full gallop, necks straining and feet flying. Their riders were stretched low on their necks, gripping the heaving withers. Suddenly one of them stood up and leapt onto the back of the neighboring horse, while the other rider did likewise. For an instant they crossed each other in the air, hanging there in sickening immobility, while the horses thundered on. Then they slipped onto the horses' backs, and a cheer from the crowd went up. They turned backward and flipped themselves around like acrobats, and all the while the horses hurtled forward. Scarves and handkerchiefs had been placed at intervals on the track, and the riders leaned so far down to scoop them up that their heads were right beside the pounding hooves. At each victorious feat, the crowd grew more excited. Behind the first pair, there were now several others, all performing dangerous stunts on the galloping, skittish horses. In attempting to grab a scarf near the sharp turn at one end of the circus, one of the riders slipped off and his horse ran over him. A groan escaped from the crowd, but it was a groan that had a hungry edge to it. A team of men dashed from the sidelines to carry off the victim in a litter, but they were almost run down by other horses and had to let the man lie there to be trampled for one more round. Ptolemy was leaning forward, trembling with fear and excitement. "Is he dead?" he kept asking. It surely looked as if he was. Before I could answer, another rider fell off. His head exploded in a red spray as his horse's hoof landed right in the middle of it. This one was indeed dead. The sand was beginning to be streaked with red. I looked around at the Romans surrounding me. Their eyes were fixed on the arena, and they seemed to have little revulsion for what they saw. The noise in the stands was growing steadily, feeding on the violence as a fire feeds on straw. The teams attempted increasingly more difficult feats until the winners did 2 mid-air somersaults between the galloping horses, landing precariously on the slippery, sweating backs. Caesar awarded them the prize, and the remaining 14 or 15 pairs of foam-flecked horses were led off the track. A company of workers ran out and began raking the sand, getting ready for the next event. A late afternoon breeze had sprung up. Normally this was the part of the day reserved for relaxation, but the tension was mounting. "Why do they want to kill people?" Ptolemy was asking. "Why does anyone want to be one of those riders?" "Men are ever drawn to dangerous enterprises," I said. "No matter how dangerous a mission, someone will always volunteer for it." The fact had always puzzled me. Just then there was a stirring in Caesar's section. Octavian had stood up and was making his way over to us. "The most noble triumphator has asked that I sit with you and explain the proceedings," he said. The ambassador from Tarsus quickly vacated his seat next to me. "How thoughtful of the triumphator," I said. I nodded to Caesar. "Did you enjoy the exhibition?" Octavian asked. "For an exhibition, some men paid a high price. Their lives," I said. "But their skill was impressive. What is the next event?" Octavian smiled. "It is the favorite sport here in Rome, chariot races. Originally, they were a religious rite. Today, there will be 10 4-horse teams, and the winners will come away with big purses of gold." "Oh, that should be exciting," said Ptolemy, "and safer." Octavian shook his fair young head. "Hardly. Someone always gets killed. Sometimes 3 or 4 chariots get tangled up and are all destroyed. The sharp turns at each end of the circus invariably cause some to turn over, even if nothing else goes wrong." "Is that why everyone likes the races so much?" asked Ptolemy. "I wouldn't say that," said Octavian. Then why don't they make them safer? Ptolemy persisted. That would ruin the sport of it. A shout rose, and I saw that the chariots were emerging from the entrance arches. Each team burst through the narrow arch, horses pulling at the reins, eager to run. Behind them, the light chariots with their drivers standing on the tiny platforms, wheeled and shone in the golden afternoon sunlight. The horses were as large as possible, while the chariots were small and feather light, which meant they were unstable and easily bounced and overturned. The helmets of the men glistened, some with spikes, some with feathers, and some with colored scarves. Octavian had stood up and was shouting. His cheeks were flushed, and his eyes were riveted on one particular chariot driven by a swarthy man and pulled by 4 bay horses with unusually thin, long legs. Those are mine, he said hoarsely, from the stable of Arius. I had never suspected he could show such fervor. You choose one, he said. There was another team of particularly well-favored horses, cream-colored with gray manes and tails. I knew full well that a pleasing configuration did not always mean speed or stamina, just as a pleasant demeanor in men did not necessarily denote honesty, but I was still drawn to them. The team with the small driver, I said. From Campania, he said. They are reputed to be well fed and trained. Which is Caesar's favorite? Ptolemy asked. He is partial to the black, said Octavian, because that stable bred his own favorite riding horse, but they are more powerful than speedy. The teams trotted once around the track, 40 horses abreast, sweeping around the turn like a giant wing. The drivers must have had extraordinary skill to keep them all in line in this manner. Finally, they halted just in line with us and waited for the signal to begin. Caesar rose and held up a large white cloth. He raised it above his head and then, releasing it, let it float down to the arena. When it touched the ground, signalmen lowered their banners and the horses were let loose. 2 or 3 of the teams leaped instantly ahead and began immediately to struggle for the best position on the track. The width of 4 horses yoked in parallel meant that the competitors could not crowd too close together, but they also needed to make close turns if they were not to fall behind. The inside team risked being dashed against the central axis of the circus and wrecked. The middle one squeezed into an accident, and the outside one losing his position by having to cover a great distance. The leaders were Octavian's bays and 2 others on the very first turn. One careened out of control and smashed on the wall of the spectators' stand. Immediately, one of the other teams, which had been hovering just behind, moved up into the vacated outside position. Another team hit the wreck of the first one and was itself wrecked. The chariots seemed to explode and the driver was thrown a long distance while his horses galloped aimlessly on. The spectators were standing now, yelling. Beside me, Octavian was breathing rapidly, muttering, "Yes, yes," as his team kept its lead, and he jumped to his feet. Only Caesar remained sitting, watching intently but calmly. Another turn, another wrecked chariot. This one tumbled over into the central axis and impaled itself on a statue of Jupiter, who had been presiding over the contest. The horses squealed with fear and pain as they went down in a tangle of harness. Now Caesar's team unexpectedly began gaining on the others, coming up from the outside in a burst of speed. There were only 7 teams left, leaving more room to maneuver. Octavian's charioteer and the other one lashed their horses as from the corner of their eyes they saw the intruder catching up. But Caesar's team, fresher than the others because it had conserved its energy, kept pace with them. It was unable to pass them, however, because it had to cover such a great distance in pacing using the outside lane. My team was hanging back at a respectable distance in a clump of the middle runners. One lone team of horses, all differently colored, brought up the rear. On the next to last turn, the middle chariot of those in the lead seemed to stumble. Suddenly it fell back into the knot of the other 3. There was no room for it. The chariots on either side were unable to find a safe place for themselves. The 3 collided, including the former leader, and the grinding wheels and splintering wood were sickening. They were so enveloped in each other, harnesses crossed, yokes rammed together, limbs entangled, that they went down in a mass together, the horses and men crying out in one long anguished scream. My team skidded around them, saved only by the fact that it had been lagging on the outside. A roar went up from the crowd, almost a sigh of pleasure at the flying debris, the wheels rolling away, the chariot railings flying through the air, the arms and legs waving from the mess, the screams cut short by the stampeding horses pounding the helpless drivers into the dirt with their deadly hooves. The lead chariots thundered on unconcerned, and the hungry crowd had a choice of 2 equally arousing sights to satisfy them: the speed and flying finish of the front runners and the carnage of the losers, stirring feebly on the sand behind them. Soon the leaders swept around to that section again and had to steer wildly to avoid the mess. A gigantic cheer went up. Octavian's chariot won, followed by Caesar's blacks. Mine finished a distant third, and the last one received an affectionate cheer, probably because by being so comically slow it had preserved its own life. "Congratulations," I said to Octavian. "You choose well. How did you know?" He turned to look at me, and I saw how clear and light his blue eyes were, with a little darker rim around the outside of the irises. He looked utterly detached, but I could not help noticing how ragged his breath still was, as he struggled to get his excitement under control. "A lucky guess," he said. I looked at the legs and ignored all the rest. Caesar was standing, ready to receive the winning charioteer. The young man, trembling and covered with sweat, was led to him. Caesar placed the laurel wreath on his head. "We triumph together this day," he said. The charioteer looked at him adoringly. "I will preserve this always," he said, touching the laurel wreath. "I will keep it for my children and my children's children and say, 'This I won on the day of great Caesar's triumph.'" "If he keeps on racing, he won't have any children," said Ptolemy in my ear. "He'd better retire now." There were several more chariot races, but none as exciting as the first. There were more 4-horse races and several 2-horse ones. They went on until it was almost too dark to see. But then riders entered the circus with torches and announced that it was over. Behind them I could see a parade of elephants, each with a torch mounted on its back. They filed into the arena and walked around once majestically, the circle of fire punctuating the twilight. One elephant, fitted with a huge platform on his back, approached the stand where we sat and knelt. Caesar will now be borne back to his home in the Forum. All loving citizens are welcome to accompany him, the announcer shouted. Caesar rose and descended to the kneeling beast, then mounted his back. The obedient animal lurched to his feet, and Caesar, his ceremonial toga's gold embroidery, winking in the torchlight, turned and lifted his hand to the people. Then he rode slowly away. The rest of us mounted on other elephants, sharing them. Ptolemy and I were on one, Octavian and Calpurnia on another, the other nephews on a third. Between the line of the rest, the dignitaries walked, then streaming out behind them, as far as I could see, came the people. The torchlight threw long jumping shadows on them, knitting them into one big creature instead of thousands of separate ones. Ahead of us, I could see the rain of flowers and tokens being showered on Caesar, could hear the shouts rise wherever he passed, sighing like people let out into the light after a long imprisonment. Caesar! 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 They cried, our joy, our savior, our life. The parade went through the Forum, retracing in jubilation the way of the triumph, a throng of careless worshippers. They were fed, they were entertained, they were lovingly looked after by Caesar. They wanted for nothing. They escorted him to his house. He climbed down from the elephant, then stood for a moment in the doorway. Good night, all my friends. Good night, my friends all, he said. I thank you for this day. Then he turned and went inside. The door shut gently. I waited a moment, then saw Calpurnia and Octavian enter behind him. I ached to follow, to be with him in this aftermath of this extraordinary day, often the most precious part of all, when it could be savored in private, but when the blood was still coursing with the victory of it. Let us return to the villa, I said, to the man leading the elephant. I turned to Ptolemy. We cannot enter, we do not belong with them tonight, I explained. It is their moment. I would pass the night alone, excluded from Caesar's private celebration, but so would his only son. The sun rose in a cloudless sky the next morning, as if Caesar had ordered it to do so. The perfect weather meant that the expansive and expensive public exhibitions and celebrations surrounding each successive triumph could go on unimpeded. Today was to be theatrical performances in the morning and Greek-style athletic contests in the afternoon in a temporary theater in the campus marshes, while simultaneously patrician boys were to enact a mock battle called the Game of Troy elsewhere on the fields. In the Circus Maximus, hundreds of condemned prisoners and prisoners of war fought in a gigantic gladiatorial contest on the sands where the chariots had raced the day before. I was told they fought together in companies, horsemen against horsemen, foot soldiers against foot soldiers, with a company of 40 elephant-mounted warriors against one another. The sand was soaked with their blood, but I did not see it, nor did I wish to. The Roman appetite for blood bewildered me. All day long I could hear from the upper windows of my chamber the shouts and cries of the crowds, drinking in the violence as the sand drank in the blood. A sea of people had swarmed into Rome to feed on the excitement, the gore, and the free food. A city of tents had sprung up, so that the Rome I beheld from the summit of the hill was twice as big as when I had arrived. People lost their lives in the crush down there. Some who had come merely to enjoy the death and violence ended up sharing it, trampled in the crush of bodies. 2 senators were killed that way, as well as nameless others. I dreaded the next triumph, the one celebrating Caesar's victory in Egypt. I would have to watch as representations of my own country were paraded past me, would have to smile with approval at the subjugation depicted. All eyes would be on me, and I must not flinch. That was the only way to show that my regime was different. The true government of Egypt, the one in alliance with Rome. I almost hated Caesar for imposing this on me. I did not know if I could stand it, yet stand it I must. His political judgment here was correct, however much it hurt to obey it. The second triumph over Egyptus. Cool day, stiff breeze, racing clouds, very un-Egyptian weather. Again, we were seated in the stands at the end of the Via Sacra. This time, the silken sun canopy whipped up and down the wind. I had attired myself in Ptolemy in Greek-style clothes for the occasion. Let everyone remember that we were the descendants of Alexander's general. No glittering headdress with cobras rearing on my forehead, no broad collar of pharaonic jewels, no ostrich feathers. In me, today, there would be nothing exotic or foreign. A simple diadem, low across my forehead, was better than a crown today. Again the shouts as Caesar passed through the different stations of the city on his way to the forum. Then the sounds rising as he approached us, of movement came from the far end of the forum as the musicians led the way of the procession. First came a company of native Egyptians blowing silver trumpets and beating on long drums, clashing cymbals and waving ivory clappers, followed by a retinue of dancers, oiled and leaping. Behind them walked a company of women wearing the thinnest linen gowns, shaking their sistrums and chanting. A sigh went up from the crowd. This was the mysterious East, brought to them in the forum itself. Shaven-headed priests of Isis, trailing incense and intoning hymns to the goddess, followed. In contrast, the magistrates of Rome, bulky in their togas, stepped lively behind them, looking disdainful of the nonsense of Egypt. The wagons were coming. I braced myself to endure the sight of the treasures of Egypt heaped in them, even though Caesar had not taken them. Indeed, I had given them, but who knew that? And they were just as thoroughly gone from Egypt no matter how they got here. The first of them was heaving into view, an enormous lumbering thing made of acanthus wood, a precious wood of our region. Inside it were arrayed gilded statues in mummy cases, small obelisks and scarves woven with jewels. The next cart, made with enormously thick wheels, contained the gray wax statue I had just given Caesar. I was thankful then that most of our art treasures were so heavy that no conqueror could cart them off. At least the pyramids and Sphinx were safe, and the great temples along the Nile, and the lighthouse. But I spoke too soon, for the lighthouse itself appeared, a gigantic model of it, on a specially constructed wagon. Its top glowed red, and a light winked out of it. It was followed by a representation of the river Nile, a luxurious, bearded, reclining man of ample proportions, surrounded by crocodiles and horns of plenty. Next came the living spoils, animals from Egypt and Africa. There were crocodiles rumbling along in their wooden cages, then panthers and ostriches, and finally the creature that excited everyone's curiosity, a giraffe. There had never been one in Rome before, and the people were amazed by it. They cried out that it seemed to be half camel and half leopard, and asked how they had ever bred. Then the first of the prisoners came into view, a wax figure of Pothinus, chillingly accurate, rolled by in his own chariot. I had thought never to see his slick evil face again, but his head was attached, something that could only happen in art and imagination. His fellow conspirator Achilles made his appearance, leering from a wagon in effigy. I shuddered how those men had once held power over me. Now they were reduced to wax dummies before a jeering crowd. I began to understand the need that the triumph satisfied. Vile eunuch! People were spitting on Pothinus. Kill her! Kill her! Kill her! A group rushed from the stands toward the effigy of Achilles. They pelted it with dung and offal. You killed our Pompey! They were about to wrench the dummy from its cart when soldiers stopped him. Nay, they said, you must not rob others of the opportunity to spit on him. Now the dead were replaced by the living. Dragging by me in chains was Ganymedes. His hair was long and matted, his face pale from his long imprisonment. No trace now of the elegant palace tutor. He flinched as waves of trash were thrown at him. Luckily, he probably did not understand most of the Latin curses and abuse that were shouted at him. His eyes were dull, his spirits had long since been broken. And then, O ye gods, it was Arsinoe. She walked some 50 feet behind him, bound in silver chains, but her head was held high. It took all her effort not to bend under the weight of the chains. But she stood erect and walked with sure pace. She was thin, her cheeks were gaunt, and I could see the bones of her shoulders. The proud Arsinoe, a captive in a Roman triumph, being led like a spoil through the forum, and thence to her death. It could have been I lowered my eyelids and let the image dim, and I could see myself walking in her place, the vanquished. If I had sided against Rome, if fate had not favored me. Beside me, Ptolemy was crying. I clutched his hand. Don't look, I said. But just then Arsinoe turned and looked at me, a riveting, direct gaze. Her eyes were drawn to mine and would not let me go. Hatred burned there, and anger leapt across the space separating us. I was the captive, held in her stare. She passed me by, her spirit already elsewhere, so it seemed. The crowd was now watching her, and sighs of sympathy rose in the air like currents. Hostile eyes turned on me. Suddenly I was the villain and she the wronged one. How could they forget so readily? Arsinoe had fought against Rome, but Romans had a soft spot for the underdog. They saw a beautiful princess in chains and forgot Caesar. No taunts or rubbish followed her. A hushed, respectful silence descended. Files of sacrificial oxen followed in her wake, bound for death, and that just excited the crowd further. They moaned with pity, this poor princess being led like one of the white oxen to her doom. Now Caesar appeared, resplendent, but he rode into a sullen arena filled with low murmurs. The sight of his lictors and gold chariot did not stir people as it had the first time. There were a few shouts and cheers sounding thin in their vast space. Some people threw vials of perfumed oil, and one landed on the rim of his chariot and broke. He seized the broken bottle and held it aloft. "Well done," he cried. "I always say that my soldiers fight just as well stinking of perfume." That brought the crowd around, changed the mood. They began shouting and stamping. "Is this Egyptian perfume?" he cried, seizing the moment. They roared with approval. I tell you, the perfumes of Egypt are rich beyond imagining, and I have brought them all to you. He waved expansively. "I shall distribute them along with your largesse. There's cassia and camphor and oil of lilies." Where was he going to get these on such short notice? I knew he had not procured any in Egypt. Octavian, riding behind him, was also dodging perfume flasks. "Cleopatra and her many perfumed oils," the crowd yelled. For an instant, Caesar froze. Then he turned and presented me to the crowd. With his extended arm, they screamed and stamped. Quickly he rode on. My face burned. I felt the presence of Calpurnia intensely, even though I could not see her. Octavian jerked his head back and kept looking straight ahead. The tramping of the soldiers' feet drowned out all other sounds. They were shouting and singing in chorus the Cleopatra song again. Now joined by the crowds, new verses were added. While the lighthouse blazed and the soldiers gazed, Caesar spent his nights and days in his Cleopatra phase. I hated this, I hated it. How could Caesar endure it so good-naturedly? It was like being led in the triumph himself. Days and nights were all the same. He sported himself until he was lame. He always knew how to play that game, and now he gives us the queen to blame. Enough, I could stand no more of this. Was I supposed to laugh as Caesar did? They were calling me a whore. At last a horrible procession passed by, and the triumph was over. It was over. The spectacle to follow this triumph was a naval battle fought in Rome. Caesar sent a message to tell us that the customary litter would be sent for us and that our presence was essential, as it had been for the Egyptian triumph. This time the litters set out away from the Circus Maximus, and we were transported toward the river. The crowds were thick, and I could see the sites where they camped at night. There were fewer buildings here, but I still saw several temples abutting on a huge pillared complex that ended in a theater. "Why, it's almost as big as one of our temples," said Ptolemy in a shrill voice. What could it be? I must ask Caesar. Oh, if only that building had never existed. I shudder now to recall it, but then in the sunlight it seemed innocent enough. And is a building to blame for what evil men do inside it? Where is that temple with enemy territory around it? Asked Ptolemy. The one where the Romans throw blood-tipped spears to start a war. I had to confess I did not know what he was talking about. Another thing to ask Caesar. Abruptly, the litters were set down, and our attendants helped us out. As we alighted, I thought my eyes were deceived, but before us was a lake, and upon it were true ships, biremes, triremes, and quadriremes, massed in two wings, banners flying. A gigantic crowd surrounded the entire basin of the lake, milling and shouting. A gallery had been built on stilts on the shore, and I could see Caesar and the knot of his family and attendants already grouped upon it. We mounted the platform and were shown our seats. From this height, the spectacle was even more miraculous. The artificial lake that had been excavated on the campus marshes, the field of Mars, must have been at least half a mile long. And who knew how deep? Obviously deep enough to accommodate warships. I saw Caesar watching my face as if he had dug the entire thing just to see my reaction. I was stunned and could not hide it. I knew he would send Octavian over, and I was right. He made his way to us, his eyes watchful. "Greetings, your majesties," he said. "We are pleased you could join us for this triumph and its celebration." Was it my imagination, or did he stress the word "this" and look carefully at us? "It was necessary for us to behold it," I said, being as honest as I could. "I do not pretend that it was not painful. It brought back many ugly memories." "Caesar will be distressed to hear it. He is under the impression that you regarded those people as enemies, as did he. And the sight of an enemy in chains is usually an exhilarating one. Perhaps when you have actually fought a war, you will understand," I said. He was just a boy and had never seen a battle, and his smugness was unpleasant to me at the moment. Yet I should have disguised my reaction better. "Tell me of this spectacle," I said lightly. "Is there no engineering miracles the Romans cannot perform?" "None that I am aware of," he replied with that cold, perfect smile. This entertainment was to feature a naval battle between the fleets of Tyre and Egypt. 2,000 oarsmen and 1,000 fighting men from each nation manned their respective ships, and at the sound of trumpets cast off from the spots where they rocked on the sparkling water. I assumed it was to be an exhibition only, but as smoke rose from one of the ships and men dived overboard, followed by groans and screams, I suddenly became aware that it was real. I turned to Octavian accusingly. "What is this? Are these men called upon to mimic fighting or to fight?" "In Naumachia, the great battles are reenacted in all their particulars," he said. "We have staged the Battle of Salamis, with the Athenians defeating the Persians, and watched the Carthaginian fleet being destroyed again and again from the comfort of our seats." "If a war is once fought and an issue decided, is that not final?" I demanded. "What purpose is served in fighting it again? Will history's verdict be reversed?" The ships were ramming one another, grapnels were hurled, and soldiers swarmed onto enemy ships. Swords flashing firebrands flew through the air, setting rigging aflame. Some of these missiles landed among the spectators, causing screams and panic. The ships swung around as the men on them struggled for mastery. I saw bodies being flung overboard, and dark stains of blood began to spread out on the water. The first ship sank, and screams rose from it, and then drowned in silence. "Are men to die for our amusement?" I cried. I looked at the others on our platform, who were nodding and watching, smiles on their faces. 2 men were conferring about the tactics, and I saw Agrippa arguing about some maneuver. Caesar looked pleasantly entertained. Blood everywhere. Why did the sun not shine red on Rome, beaming through a haze of blood? Why did it rise in an ordinary color? Can there not be a chariot race without death, a sailing exhibition without death, a swordplay without death? I tugged on Octavian's shoulder, where the toga was bunched. Why must death be a sauce to accompany everything you Romans devour? Devour, that was the word for what they did. They devoured everything, and they needed a lively spice for their digestion. Because without death, everything is bland, he said. Without a final price, everything is make-believe. Even as he spoke, his voice soft and reasonable against the background cries of wounded men and the shudders of ship timber against timber, I pictured Arsinoe being strangled in the dark, airless, stone prison cell. Death in the sunlight and death in the dark, the two kinds of Roman death. Abruptly, I left the entertainment. I assumed the nausea lasted until after sunset. As it got dark, from the top of the highest part of the villa's hill, I could see winking torches in the campus marshes. I also could see what looked like bonfires, but from their sheer size I knew they were the burning hulks of ships. The spectacle had consumed itself. I felt sick and exhausted. I wished to bathe and then stretch myself out on my bed and purge my mind of the hideous images that were racing through it. But before I could do so, the door of the house flew open and Caesar stamped in. His face was a mask of anger. "How dare you leave?" he yelled as soon as he saw me. No other greeting was offered. "You shamed me, you insulted me, you have caused every tongue in Rome to natter." How had he got away from all the people? Where were his guards, his attendants, the ever-worshipful Octavian? I could not stand it anymore, I said. "The killing." "So you have a weak stomach for killing. Perhaps you're not a true Ptolemy after all." I stared at him. He was ranting, red-faced, like an angry merchant. "I think killing should be reserved for danger, not sport," I finally said. "You devalue death to treat it so casually. It is the great final thing and should not be demeaned." "Egyptians revere death too much," he grunted. "Romans revere it too little," I said. "Yet we both make art out of it. You with your tombs and paintings and mummies, and we with our entertainments." His temper seemed to have cooled. But I was not fooled. He was most angry when he showed it least. "Enough of this death talk. By leaving you undid all you had done earlier by attending the triumph." "It was horrible, but I did not cover my eyes." I paused. "I hated every second of it. I hated seeing Egyptian treasures in the carts, hated the verses they sang about you in the perfume bottles. Is that what people think of me? Be thankful that's what they think. It's harmless enough." "Arsinoe, it was dreadful and the people were stirred in sympathy." "Yes." He walked toward a bench and sat down on it. His shoulders sagged. "I spared Arsinoe." My first feeling was a rush of relief. My second was worry. Arsinoe the Proud would not retire quietly. Where is she to go? "She has requested sanctuary at the great temple of Diana in Ephesus," he said, "and I will grant it if you agree." Ephesus? Too close to Egypt. Better send her to Britain. Yet I would gamble and be merciful. Perhaps I was not enough of a Ptolemy after all. Arsinoe would not have granted it. Yes, I will allow it. Ganymedes is dead. Ganymedes had been dead already, the broken creature I had seen in the forum. There could have been no reprieve for him. "We must do something to offset the bad impression your leaving gave today," Caesar insisted. The crowd was in a dangerous mood. You sensed it. The perfume bottles at least allowed us to divert them. But they were not wholehearted in their cheers. And it may be worse in the other two triumphs to follow, especially the one over Africa, because Cato died in that war. I think in order to quell any rumors that you harbor any enmity to Rome, you must give a lavish entertainment here to celebrate the Egyptian triumph tomorrow. And it is then that I will formally proclaim you and Ptolemy friend and ally of the Roman people. I'll invite all my enemies and shut them up. No, I don't want to give any party. I don't want to give a party. All those people hate me. You sound like a child. His voice began to lift, and for the first time I sensed that his anger had gone. Of course they hate you. It should make you proud. If they hate you, remember that they hated me first. You must get used to being hated if you are to rule successfully. The greatest weakness a ruler can have is the aching need to be loved. That is why Cicero, whom I shall by all means invite, would be a disaster as a ruler, even though he wants to be one so badly. Not Cicero. My dear, if you can withstand the withering gazes and eloquent insults of Cicero, you can withstand anything. Consider it training. Caesar would take care of everything, this being his gathering in effect. Another of his triumphal entertainments. Ptolemy and I were to leave the house and amuse ourselves elsewhere. I requested that we be taken out into the countryside, so that we might see what surrounded Rome. It proved to be a good choice. The ripening fields of grain, green gold against arched aqueducts bringing water from afar, and the clustered flocks of sheep were a cool antidote for the fevered insanity of the crowded city. This countryside had a somnolent beauty, drowsy and warm. Even the clouds were rounded and gentle. I found it deeply restorative. But the sun began to throw slanted shadows as its setting neared, and the day was over all too soon. We must return. To what? The torches were already lit along the road by the time we re-entered the city. The crowds were still swarming. Even on this uneventful day, there were theatrical performances and athletic contests, as well as gladiatorial contests between upper-class Romans in the Forum to amuse the populace. I began to have misgivings as we entered the grounds of the garden and found it transformed into what a man costumed as Osiris announced as canopic pleasure gardens. Colored lanterns were strung from tree to tree, and drinking pavilions had been set up under the branches filled with rowdy patrons. As we ascended the hill, the landscape grew more and more fantastic. We seemed to be wading through a papyrus marsh complete with statues of hippos and crocodiles, and then approached the house, which had been given a false front to make it look like a temple by the Nile. The river itself had been recreated in the form of a large moat around the entrance. A pyramid about 15 feet high reared itself just beside the entrance steps, where the Nile lapped against the stones. "Welcome to Egypt," bellowed a huge Nubian, clad only in the scantiest loincloth, stationed at the entrance. Just inside the atrium, a company of musicians sat, playing the lyre, flute, and bells. Eerie, light music floated out. This was some soldier's heated dream of Egypt. It was nothing like Alexandria or the villages along the Nile. It existed only in the fevered imaginations of someone longing for a land of pleasure. It was a product of Roman prurience. It got worse. Vials of perfume and scented ointment were piled up into pyramids all around the atrium, and there was a fortune-telling sphinx by the pool. If you knocked on his paws, an echoing voice inside pronounced your fate. Half-naked dancers were writhing and bending to the musicians' tunes. A gigantic sarcophagus, gilded and festooned, was propped upright against the furthest wall. its lid removed to reveal a wrapped mummy. But the mummy had very alert eyes, and I could see his chest moving up and down. Beside him, a masked Anubis was keeping watch, his jackal's ears pointed and upright. I felt myself grow cold. What madness had taken hold of Caesar to make him create this grotesque setting? I entered my chamber to find a message from him. True to the spirit of the banquet, he had enclosed it in a miniature obelisk. My dearest, forgive me for this travesty modeled on Egypt. Politics oblige us to do many unseemly things. Remember that what one laughs at, one does not fear. And if by a fortune-telling sphinx a dancing mummy, Romans forget the riches of Egypt and think it only a country of pleasure gardens, they will be content to let it alone. It will remain yours in perpetuity. Look beautiful as only you can, so that my enemies can never say my powers of desire are waning. Caesar was correct in one thing. This certainly made a mockery of Egypt. Well then, should I complete the masquerade? Should I be the serpent of the Nile? Why not? I ransacked my trunks for attire that would serve, combining the most extreme elements of costume. I put on an all but transparent gown fringed with golden faience beads. I twined serpent bracelets on my upper arms and tinkling anklets on my feet. I draped my neck in a four-tiered gold collar and put on a head-hugging vulture headdress. My feet were encased in jeweled sandals. Surprisingly, the whole was not ugly, but arrestingly strange. I looked like an idol in the dark sanctuary of a temple. The combination of the heavy gold and the gossamer gown gave me a feeling of unreality. My clothing was as light as a breath, but I was weighted down with metal. I found fantastic garments for Ptolemy, and I ordered the nurse to dress Caesarion. I would achieve my purpose this night. I would force Caesar to it. This night would serve me as well as him. Charmian, have you ever seen anything like this in Egypt? I gestured around me to the pyramid of perfume and the swaying musicians. Never, she said with a soft laugh. But should such a land exist, it would have a queen that looks like you tonight. The guests began arriving. I had no idea how many Caesar had invited. As if the gods had read my wishes, a young woman purporting to be a niece of Caesar's sought me out and said he had asked her to stand by my side all evening and explain who everyone was, lest I grow confused. My name is Valeria, she said. I will try to explain about them as honestly and briefly as possible. She looked at me clearly taken aback by my costume. I do not usually look like this, I assured her, even in Egypt, especially not in Egypt. This was Caesar's suggestion. He seems determined that this evening will outdo every parody of Egypt. She laughed outright, a hearty laugh. He has got his wish. Rest assured, Your Majesty, that my uncle and I have always seen eye to eye about people. That is why he chose me to be his spokesman this evening. I hope you will not think me rude when I speak my mind. No, I welcome it. He himself foresees that he may be busy, but there were many things he wished you to know. Guests started pouring in the entrance, their feet wet from wading through the Nile. I stationed myself at the far end of the atrium near the mummy. A group of senators and their wives were the first to be presented, and none of them was important enough to elicit a comment from Valeria. They circled the pyramid of scent and were urged by the dancers, "Help yourself, take some." A knot of people I did not recognize came in with two I did, Brutus and his mother Servilia. I smiled as they approached. With them were several men, all wearing senatorial togas. One was thin and dark with a straight, lowering line of eyebrows. Another was beefy and red-faced. And a third had an expression that combined worry and self-complacency. Gaius Cassius Longinus, muttered the first one, almost spitting out the words. I did not need Valeria to inform me this man did not care for me. How he felt about Caesar I could not know yet. Publius Servilius Casca, said the stocky one. He nodded gravely and passed on. Marcus Tullius Cicero, said the third, as if he found it amusing he should have to introduce himself. Cicero, he had the surprising attribute of looking almost exactly like his boss. My wife Publilia, he said, presenting a woman who looked more like his granddaughter. She smirked and bowed. Cicero lingered by my side. The spoils of Egypt, he said lightly, indicating the room decorations. His hand circled the periphery and then, ever so casually, included me in his sweep. How I should love to travel there and behold it. You must visit us, I said, but I have been told you regard leaving Rome as being an exile, even when you were governor of Cilicia. It is true that I find myself happiest in Rome. It has all that a human being needs in order to fulfill himself. He sighed like a smitten schoolboy. Truly he was in love with Rome, in that he was sincere. I know that wherever the government is to be found, there Cicero calls himself content, I said. And the government of the world is in Rome, he said pointedly. It is true that Rome has conquered much of the world, I replied, but she has yet to perfect a means of governing it, especially from Rome. The boundaries of the empire stretch now far to the north and west, as well as to the east. Cicero stiffened. The Republic is the best system of government in the world. Government the world has ever created, he said. Until now, I insisted, but the Republic may not lend itself to governing a large area. Rome was a small city, after all, when it was invented. I expected him to say something witty, but instead he drew his robes around himself, as if he had been contaminated, and muttered, "Come," to Publilia. And they wandered off into the large banqueting chamber. Cicero made a mistake in marrying that girl, said Valeria in my ear. He wanted her money, but he's got more than he bargained for. She's very beautiful, I admitted. He should have stuck with his grumbling old former wife, said Valeria. They were well suited. I remember the dark looks of the first man. Cassius, what about him? I asked. He's one of Pompey's generals who came over to Caesar afterwards. He's related to Brutus by marriage. They glower together. So he's one of the ones Caesar forgave. Did he come willingly? I asked. I am not sure. I think the former followers of Pompey gave up after his death. They have shown little interest in supporting his sons. But do they support Caesar? She thought for a moment before answering. They tolerate him, she finally said. Octavia arrived with her husband Gaius Claudius Marcellus, a handsome man. He also was in Pompey's party and pardoned by Caesar, Valeria informed me. I was beginning to feel that all of Rome had been pardoned by Caesar. That meant he had an enormous number of former enemies at large. More people swept into the room. They were coming in great waves, the hems of their gowns wet from the crossing of the Nile, but they were smiling and laughing, so perhaps the ludicrous staging was one of Caesar's ideas of genius. Nothing else would have put his critics in so jolly a mood. A middle-aged man, accompanied by two women, entered hesitantly, then made a straight path toward us. He appeared thin under the voluminous toga, but then that was one of the glories of a toga. It hid fat and bones alike, so one could never tell the true dimensions of the wearer underneath. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, he introduced himself. I have the honor of serving as consul with Caesar this year. He smiled warmly. My wife, Junia. He is too modest, said his wife. He served as Caesar's right-hand man as governor of further Spain, while Caesar fought in the east. He held it for him. Lepidus looked embarrassed. My wife overpraises me, he said. No one could be called Caesar's right-hand man. I would say it is enough to serve as his left-hand man, but that sounds threatening, he laughed. Caesar has granted him a triumph for his actions in Spain. His wife persisted. Enough, Junia, he said. No one likes a braggart. The other woman now spoke up. I am also Junia, Junia's sister, and the wife of Cassius. Then you are also Brutus's sister. How confusing all these names were. Why did all of a man's daughters share the same name in Rome? Indeed, she said. They passed on into the larger room, and I turned to Valeria. At last, a wholehearted supporter of Caesar, I said. Yes, but he is such a broken reed to lean upon. She shook her head. Lepidus is flaccid. In what way, I wondered, on the battlefield or in bed? I watched his wife's back as she disappeared into the throng. A woman approached us boldly. She was with no man, but carried herself with a soldier's gait. She was rather attractive, with masses of wheat-colored hair bound in at her neck and a wide jaw. Fulvia, your majesty, she said, looking directly into my eyes. She waited a moment before saying, of the Fulvian family of Tusculum, as if that would enlighten me. But I had heard of her. What had I heard? Was she not that fiery wife of the insurrectionist Claudius? I remembered hearing her name in connection with the street fights of Rome. Welcome, I said, thinking how fierce she looked, like an Amazon. Is she not the widow of Claudius? I asked Valeria a moment later. Valeria looked surprised. So her fame has spread even to Alexandria, she said. Indeed she is, and also of Curio. She does not look as if she will need another husband, I said. He would have to be Hercules. They say that is exactly what she has in mind, replied Valeria. As if this were a staged performance, she had scarcely got the words out when a man dressed as Hercules burst through the doorway. He was big and muscled like a bear, and with a lion's skin knotted around his neck and a club slung over his shoulder. He looked Olympian. Hanging on his arm was a woman so garishly dressed I had to blink to behold her. He didn't, said Valeria. He didn't bring her. The man made his way over to us, striding easily. He stopped and stared at me as if he were seeing a curiosity of nature. He had a wife, well-formed face. He had a wide, well-formed face with intelligent dark eyes and a thick neck and a smile that would have blinded a god. How the child has changed, he blurted out. Princess Cleopatra, do you not remember me? I am Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony. I came to Alexandria with Gabinius. I saved your throne, if you don't mind my saying so. The young soldier, yes, I remembered him now. He had changed as much as I, yes, of course. But I thought it was Gabinius who saved my father's throne, since he was the only man left. He was the only man in the world who dared undertake the task, which all of Rome had forbidden. Gabinius needed a cavalry officer, he said, and it was I who overcame the frontier fortress of Pelusium, the most difficult part of the campaign. So you did, I remembered. Now the recounting of it, how he had bravely and quickly taken the fortress, thought to be unassailable. So you did. Yes, princess, I did. He said this not particularly proudly, but as a matter of fact. I am queen now, I said likewise matter-of-factly. And Caesar's woman, he said, fortunate Caesar. He waved his hand high, beloved of the gods, to be given you as prize and treasure. His voice was too loud, and everyone heard him. Why are you dressed as Hercules? I asked, to deflect the curious ears. Why is this not a costume party? Do you mean to tell me you dress this way daily? I came as my ancestor, for I'm descended from Hercules, as everyone knows. Yes, as everyone knows, parroted the woman. May I present Cytheris, the foremost actress of Rome, said Antony innocently. Fulvia gilded over and said, My dear Antony, I have hoped to speak with you, and guided him off forcibly. Valeria could not suppress a laugh. So he brought that actress. Does he have no restraint? It is hardly the way to win back Caesar's favor. Where was Caesar? I began to long for him. The party was becoming overwhelming, and there was no one to direct it, although Antony and his actress friend would doubtless relish trying. Octavian approached, boys near his own age on each side. He had a smile on his face and seemed relatively light-hearted. Your Majesty, he said, you remember Agrippa. Beside him Agrippa nodded, and my friends Publius Vergilius Maro and Quintus Horatius Flaccus. Two pale faces stared at me as if they were bewildered by the sight. I am called Horace, said one, the sturdier one, and I am known amongst my friends as Virgil, said the older, slighter one. I must tell you, Your Majesty, I'm greatly enamored of the Alexandrian mode of poetry. They have come to Rome to study, said Octavian. All of us country boys seem to be drawn here, but afterward Horace will go to Athens, to the university there. Perhaps I'll follow him. I thought to myself that Octavian would probably be best suited to a scholarly life. I assumed he would spend his adult years espousing some field of philosophy or history and writing manuscripts no one would ever read. The boys drifted away, and I saw Octavia bringing someone over. He was a tall, impressive man who was actually flattered by the lines of a toga. I wish to present to you Vitruvius Polio, she said excitedly. The man bowed low. Your Majesty, I am honored, he said. He is dear to Caesar as an arms expert, Octavia said, but he is dear to all Rome as an architect and engineer. He understands the mysteries of water, of wood, of stone, and translates them for us. I had the honor to serve Caesar in his campaigns in Gaul and Africa, so he had been present in the last grueling war. I was grateful for whatever he had done to bring about its success. Certainly Caesar owed a great deal to his military engineers. Caesar is blessed to have men like you at his side, I said. Another woman was wandering about alone. I saw her as she entered the doorway, but she was searching the crowd for someone. There was something in her bearing that made me curious about her, and I pointed her out to Valeria. Ah, that's Claudia, she said. I thought she was dead. She shook her head. Claudia was Catullus's and Caelus's mistress. Not at the same time, of course. Now they're both dead, but she's not so young herself. She must be looking for another lover. And what better place to look than a party? I was puzzled by the Roman freedom and lack of it granted to women. They did not have their own names, but had to take versions of their fathers. They were married off callously to make political alliances and were divorced just as casually. They held no public office, nor could they command troops. Yet they themselves could instigate a divorce, and they could own property. They accompanied their husbands to social gatherings, unlike Greek women, and seemed to have their menfolk well in tow. Married women also had love affairs, so it seemed. The virtuous, respected Servilia, Mucia, the wife of Pompey. Were there others? But the men could carry them on openly, whereas the women could not. And what of women like Cytheris and Claudia? And why must Caesar's wife be above suspicion, whereas Caesar himself could carry on openly? And was I, a foreign queen, exempt from these Moors? Trumpets sounded, and a hush fell. Caesar strode into the room, even though he was not the tallest or biggest man there. The ranks gave way before him. People backed away to give all the space to him. For an instant, complete silence surrounded him, as if he were ringed by stones. Welcome, friends, welcome all, he said in a ringing voice, and suddenly sound sprung up all around him. He was alone. Calpurnia was not with him. Was that why he had come so late? Egyptian music, he commanded, and the musicians took up their playing again, the unfamiliar to the Romans, chords filling the hall. He turned and stared at me, his face not registering any emotion. Was it a good silence or a bad one? One never knew with him. The Queen of Egypt presides, he announced. The Queen reigns over this feast. He took his place next to me. You look like a whore, he whispered in my ear. This villa looks like a brothel, I whispered back. I took my cue from you, he laughed. I think it is your boldness I always loved best, he said. Why did you choose to depict Egypt in such a fashion, I demanded. I told you in my note, he replied, what we scorn we do not desire. What about whores, I asked. He looked surprised. I mean, the highest men seem to consort with them, even if they shun them in public. They are highly scorned, yet highly desired. Claudia drifted by, giving Caesar a conspiratorial look. Such as Claudia, I said, and Antony has brought an actress whom everyone is leering at. Antony would be naked without an actress everyone is leering at. He turned to Valeria. Thank you for helping. I trust that you enjoyed the task. She smiled. Gossip is always a pleasure. She detached herself and disappeared into the crowd. The feast table was laid, with a lidded crocodile skin serving to hold piles of fruit. Cherries, pears, apples, sweet figs and dates, pomegranates, huge rimmed platters swam with such sea creatures as squid and sea urchins, and oysters. Stuffed boars looked at us forlornly, their gilded bristles drooping. People swarmed around the table, stuffing themselves, washing down the food with enormous quantities of wine. The noise rose, casting us adrift in a sea of voices. At the end of the meal, the sarcophagus was wheeled into the hall by Anubis. In the midst of this feasting, it is good to remember the eternal, he wheezed. Hear what the dead are telling us. He stood back and recited, Follow thy heart's desire, while still thou remainest. Pour perfume on thy head, and let thy garment be of the finest linen, anointed with the true most wondrous substances among things divine. He did a little shuffling dance. Do that which is pleasing to thee more than thou didst more than thou didst aforetime. Let not thy heart be weary. Follow thy heart's desire, and that which is well-pleasing in thine eyes. Arrange thine affairs on earth after the will of thy heart, until thee cometh that day of lamentation on which that God, whose heart standeth still, heareth not thy wail. He leaned over the sarcophagus and spoke to the mummy. Weeping obtaineth not the heart of a man who dwelleth in the grave. On, live out a joyful day, rest not therein. The mummy started to groan and stir. The bandages heaved with breath. People were disturbed, even though they knew perfectly well it was a performance. The sight of the dead stirring is distressing. Lo, it hath not been granted to man to take away with him his belongings. Behind him the mummy threw a stiff leg out over the side of the coffin. Its fellow followed. The mummy lurched upright. Lo, there is none who hath gone hence and returned hither. Then Anubis turned and saw the mummy, and let out a howl. He threw up his hands, and then yanked up a strip of linen sticking up from the mummy's shoulder. The mummy spun and turned, unwinding itself. Free, free, he cried joyfully. Then he began turning cartwheels stiffly. He ran back to the sarcophagus, dug out handfuls of gold coins, and began flinging them to the crowd. Spend it for me, he ordered them. I'm not going back in there. Now, with the crowd in a playful mood, Caesar led a group out to the Sphinx. Ask of him your deepest concerns, he said, thumping his rump. Will Claudia get another man? Yelled someone into the mouth of the Sphinx. I see many sleepless nights for Claudia, said a muffled voice within. That's not fair, said Caesar. You can ask only for yourself, not someone else. Oh, I am asking for myself, the man answered blearily. Lepidus approached and asked it quietly, Will I lead troops again? Yes, more than you would wish, was the prompt reply, startling Lepidus. Will the Roman Republic be restored? Asked Cicero in ringing tones. A hush fell over the room. As Heraclitus says, you cannot step twice into the same waters, for other waters are ever flowing over you. Yes, I know that, said Cicero irritably. There will be different men, but what of the institution? Only one question, Kikro, bellowed Antony. Kikro glared at him and turned his back. Now I'll ask once, roared Antony. Have my fortunes reached their highest peak? Your fortune is only in the foothills, came the reply. You have not known your fortune yet. Come out and show yourself, I demanded. Who was this man? Was he truly a soothsayer or just an actor? Slowly the Sphinx's head was raised and a dark-skinned man peered out. He was frightening to look at. He was so wizened and sunburnt. Your Majesty, he asked, what question will you put to me? I knew he was not an actor. How could I phrase the question whose answer I most longed for? I would not ask it so publicly. Will Egypt be blessed by the gods in my lifetime? I finally asked. Yes, by many gods, he said, by gods in the sky and by gods standing in this very room. I felt a violent shaking trying to take hold of me. I dared not let it show. But what gods did he mean, standing in this very room? Nay, it was a foolish answer, an answer that told nothing. Just as my question had not been direct, neither had its answer. Nothing comes of nothing. Now that all are silent, said Caesar, holding up his hand, I wish to give you my thanks for coming to honor Egypt and myself. Yesterday we celebrated a triumph over rebel forces in Egypt. Today we honor its queen and king, Cleopatra and Ptolemy. And here in your presence do solemnly name them and enroll them as friend and ally of the Roman people. Socius atque amicus populi Romani. The company cheered as the gesture for which this entire evening had been preparation was enacted. Let no one question their loyalty, cried Caesar. Again a dutiful cheer went up. Now was the moment. Now I nodded to Charmian, who in turn nodded to Caesarion's nurse. She quickly left the room. Caesar, Ptolemy, and I stood before the people, and in order to hold them there at attention, I began a speech. A somewhat rambling one, I am afraid. But soon enough the newly awakened Caesarion was brought to me, dressed in kingly robes and rubbing his wide eyes. This is Egypt's greatest treasure, I said, taking him in my arms, and I lay him at your feet, Caesar. I placed the child on the floor before the hem of Caesar's robe. An immense silence fell over the crowd. Well, I knew that if Caesar picked him up, he was acknowledging him as his own. But did they know I knew? Or did they just assume I thought I was presenting a vassal prince to Caesar? It was up to Caesar to act. It was his action I cared about, not the people's. Caesar was deadly quiet. I knew then he was angry, very angry. I had tricked him, and that was unforgivable. But unlike other men, Caesar was always able to think clearly through his anger. He was able to set it aside if necessary, so that anger was never the basis of his actions. He stared down at Caesarion, his mouth set in a tight line. And what do you call this treasure? He asked in flat, measured words. He is Ptolemy Caesar. Caesar, I said loudly. People murmured, for it sounded as if I were stuttering. The two names were the same, deliberately linked. Caesar watched while Caesarion reached out and touched his sandal. Then he bent down and picked him up. He held him aloft and slowly moved him from side to side so everyone could see. Ptolemy Caesar, he said clearly. I believe you are known as Caesarion. Little Caesar, let it be so. He handed him back to me. He did not look at me, but did touch the child's cheek. We are grateful, Caesar, I said. We are yours forever. How did you dare to do this? Caesar's eyes were blazing. We were alone in the empty atrium. Food and trash lay all over the floor. I had to, I said. This was the moment. All were gathered. It was a celebration of Egypt. You tricked me, he said. You have acted like a slave girl. If I did, it was because you treated me as one. When he started to argue, I cut him off. I am not just some slave girl to bear bastard sons to her master. I'm a queen. You made me your wife in a ceremony in Philae. How dare you ignore our son? Because he has no legal standing in Rome, said Caesar. Can't you understand that? What was the point of it? There is a place where the legal ends and the moral begins, I said. By not acknowledging him publicly, you insulted me and him. It has nothing to do with legality. What do you think I am concerned about? His inheriting your property? He who will inherit all the treasures of the Ptolemies? If I allow him to, he reminded me, if I allow Egypt to remain independent. I hate you, I screamed. You don't hate me, you hate the truth of the situation, which is just as I have described it. Now lower your voice. We cannot help this situation. I cannot give Egypt back to her pharaohs, nor would I wish to. Things are as they are, and we might not flourish in any other times as we do here. And you do flourish, I said. He flourished like a great cedar towering above all others. But I was satisfied. Words aside, I had achieved my aim. In front of all Rome, Caesar had acknowledged our son. The trip to Rome had been worth it.